Now, in most of our later scenarios, when we build an application, we're going to need to build a Docker image of our application. So that means that we need to have Docker commands also available in Jenkins in order to be able to run the Docker commands. And the common way to do that is attaching a volume to Jenkins from the host file. So on the droplet itself, where the Docker container of Jenkins is running, we have Docker command available, right? We have installed Docker so that we can run Jenkins Docker container. What we're going to do is we're going to mount Docker directories or Docker runtime directory from our droplet into the container as a volume. And this will make Docker available inside the container. And this means we're going to kill our currently running container because we need to start it again with new volumes, with additional volumes. So let's actually stop our container. And we're going to create a new container. However, note that because we have mounted volume to persist all the data in /var/Jenkins home, on the server, we still have the data on the server. So we can actually mount that data into the new container so that we keep all the configuration, all the jobs, all the credentials, and everything that we created in the old container, and we can move it to the new one. So the volume is still there, Docker volume ls. We have the Jenkins home volume still available, and the path where this volume stores data is also there. So we just need to reattach it to a new container so that the new container can access that old data as well. So the full command to start a new container with all the necessary volumes is going to be like this. We're going to do docker run. The same ports as before. And here we're going to list all the volumes we need. The first one is the same one as before. Jenkins home volume already exists, so it's not going to be recreated. So this is the first volume. The second one is Docker volume. This is on the host, on the droplet itself. And we're gonna mount it into the container under the same exact destination. And those two volumes will make Docker available and Docker commands available inside Jenkins container. And now we're gonna do Jenkins latest and execute it. And this time, as I said, we don't need to initialize Jenkins and install the plugins and create the job because all the data from the old container is still there and we're just reattaching that to the new container. So now let's refresh our Jenkins server. The user should be there as well from the previous container. And we have our jobs available. So Jenkins is running, and if we go to the container, let's do docker ps, and I'm gonna exec as a root user into Jenkins container. See? So the same command as before, I'm just adding these two, user root. This is what 0 stands for. So we need to do one more thing in order to fix this so that we'll be able to execute Docker commands from the Jenkins container. With this curl command, the Jenkins container is going to fetch the latest version of Docker from the official site so it can run inside the container. Then it's going to set the correct permissions here and then run through the install. So I'm going to execute this and wait for the execution to complete. Okay, awesome. The installation is complete, and now we need to do one more thing, which is to set the correct permissions on the docker.socket file so that we can run commands from inside the container using the Jenkins user. So if I do ls display long var run docker.sock. Here you see I'm inside the container, and here you see the permissions for the owner, group, and everybody else. So we need to add some permissions for the Jenkins user on this file. And now I can add permission here, read and write permission for everybody else, including Jenkins user. And I'm going to do that using change mod command. 666 basically sets read and write permission for all three parties for this file here. So if I execute this, and then we're going to do ls again. Here you see right here, read and write permission was added. And let's log in again as Jenkins user. And now if I do docker pull Redis, this is just going to pull the image because we don't need Redis obviously in our container. And if I execute this, here you see I'm allowed to execute Docker command. And this applies to every other Docker command like docker login, docker push, docker build, etc. All the commands that we're going to need. And this means that we can execute Docker commands in any of our builds, just like we did npm. So if I go back to one of my build configurations, I can actually execute Docker commands from the execute shell section right here. So I can do docker login, docker build, etc., just like I did with npm. So this means as a next step, we're gonna build a Docker image from our Java Maven application. So after running Maven tests and then Maven package, we're gonna build a Docker image from the jar file. So now I have added a Docker file in the repository in Jenkins jobs branch. And this Docker file basically takes the jar file that was built with Maven package command and creates a Docker image out of it. So in order to be able to build that Docker image, we have to add a Docker command in our job configuration. So in Java Maven build, configure, the package step will actually execute tests as well, so we can remove it. And as a next step, we can add execute shell. And here we can execute Docker commands as we would execute it on a command line. And we're able to do it again because we have installed Docker or made it available inside the Docker container. So here I'm going to execute docker build command with current repository where Docker file is located. So now when I execute this build, when I save it and execute this build, the changes in the repository will be downloaded. The change is that I have added Docker file. And then Maven package command will be executed, and then docker build will find the Docker file and build a Docker image out of it. And we can also add a flag here for the name tag. So let's call it Java Maven app. Let's say version 1.0, so that we can identify the image when we build it. And let's save the configuration and build the project. So you see the build was successful. Let's go inside and check the logs. And here you see the package, Maven package command was executed, building the jar file, the test got executed, and here you see docker build command and the output of that command. So the image was built, finished success, and that means if we go back to our Jenkins container and do docker images, here is the image that we built, Java Maven app, and this is the tag that we gave. As a next step, we could configure the Jenkins build to push that image into a Docker repository. And we're going to do that in the next part. So let's configure our Java Maven build to push the Docker image to a Docker repository. The first step to do that is to create credentials for that Docker repository. In this example, we're gonna be pushing the image to Docker Hub's private repository because it's easy to set up. You just need an account, and out of the box, you get one private repository for free. So I already have an account on Docker Hub, and here you can create a repository. You can give a repository the name and set private and then create. So the first thing is, as I said, creating credentials for the Docker Hub repository in Jenkins. So let's actually go to Manage Jenkins, and in Security section, here you have credentials, and inside the Jenkins store, I can add credential. So this is the path, credentials/store/system domain. Add credential, username with password, and this is going to be my Docker Hub's username and password. This is my username, this is the password. Let's call it Docker Hub repo. Okay. Let's go back to our build and configure it to push the image to the repository. So the way we push image into a repository using Docker command is tagging the image with the name of the repository. So we don't have an explicit way to specify the repository name in the Docker push command. We just say Docker push and the image tag, and the image tag itself implicitly has information about where this image should be pushed. So we're going to tag the image using the repository name. So if I go back here, I'm going to copy this. This is my Docker username and repository name. I'm going to use that as a tag, and I'm going to keep the version. So for example, if you have a Java Maven application, you can call your repository in Docker Hub Java Maven or whatever, and that will be the name or the tag that you need to use when creating your image. And this part can be a version. Let's actually go with this one. And after this, we can do Docker push the image full name, including the version tag. Now, obviously, we need to use those credentials in order to authenticate with the remote Docker repository in order to be able to push that image. So what we need to do before push is Docker login to log in into the repository. And here we are going to need the credentials. In an interactive mode, when you do Docker login, obviously you can enter username and password manually. However, here we have to specify both of them as options. So how do we get access to the credentials that we created? We do it using another plugin. So if we scroll a little bit upwards, here use secret text or files. And if I click inside, I get this bindings section, and the binding plugin basically allows me to use my credentials that I have created in Jenkins. We have created a username and password credential, and these two options are basically for either using username and password separately, so you have a username and you have the password, or using them together as a credentials object. We're gonna go with individual ones, and now you get this view. So pretty simple configuration here. Actually, we're going to define the variable name ourselves for the username. Let's say this is username. And same thing with password variable. We're going to give it the variable name. And we're going to choose the credential. In this case, this is the correct one. This is the Docker Hub credentials. And this will make the username and password available throughout the whole build now using these variables. So I can just copy one of those, scroll back to our Docker login command. I'm going to do -u for username and variable username. With the $sign, you can reference a global variable. Then we can do -p, and that is going to be our password variable, and this should log us in Docker Hub. Now, Docker Hub is the default repository for Docker client. So because of that, in the login command, we don't have to specify here the Docker Hub repository server name. If you have your private repository on Nexus, for example, or AWS, etc., then you would have to specify the repository host name as an additional parameter here. But as I said, because Docker Hub is the default one, we don't have to specify here anything. And this should actually be enough to be able to push our image there. Let's actually tag it with Java Maven app -1.0 so that it's unique. Let's change it here as well. And this configuration will build the image with the correct tag, with the repository name, will log into the repository, and then push that image into the repository. So let's save this and build it. The build was successful. Let's see the output. Same as before until here. So we built image with this tag. Here we are logging in to a repository, and Docker push is pushing the image to the repository. So everything got executed successfully. Let's go to Docker Hub, refresh, and see our image here. And there you go. This is our image, which we called JMA for Java Maven app, pushed a minute ago. We can do one optimization here, which is to fix this warning here. The best practice in Docker is to actually provide password as a standard input and not directly as a command line parameter. So we can also change this in the configuration. So here we can do echo the variable name, and then we can pipe it into Docker login command. So we have the password, which we are piping into the Docker login. And here we can set the password using password std in standard input from the echo command. And let's test it out again with a different version. Let's change the version here and build the project again. So here you see that one warning is gone. And in Docker Hub, if I refresh again, I should see the latest tag 1.1, which was pushed a minute ago. So this is how you build and push a Docker image into a Docker Hub private repository from a freestyle build job in Jenkins. Now you saw that we pushed Docker image into a Docker Hub private repository. However, in the previous section, in the Nexus module, we have configured Docker repository on Nexus as well. So you may be wondering, how can we push a Docker image from Jenkins to a Nexus repository? So first, let's go ahead and open our Nexus. I'm already logged in. And in the browse section, we have this Docker hosted repository that is currently hosting just one image, which is called my app. So we want to push from Jenkins to this repository right here. Because Nexus connection is currently not secure, because it's running on HTTP port, so we have no secure connection with the Nexus repository. Because of that, we need to configure this insecure registry setting for Jenkins as well. Previously, we did it locally on our laptop so that we could push images from our laptops to Nexus repository. Now we are doing the same from Jenkins server, so we need to do that configuration in the Jenkins itself. So let's do that first. I'm gonna head over to Droplet where Jenkins is running. And since this is a Linux machine, we can do it directly in a file instead of the user interface like we did for laptop. So on Linux system, since this is Linux machine, we can configure something called a daemon.json file and add the insecure registries configuration there. And by default, the file isn't there. So if I do etc docker, there's just one key.json file. And here we're gonna create this daemon.json file. And note that I am on the Droplet server itself. I'm not in the Jenkins container. We are doing this configuration on the host because host is where Docker is installed. We have just mounted that installation into Jenkins container. So if we are configuring something for Docker, we need to do it on the server. So I'm going to create this file. And here we're going to create insecure registries configuration. It's pretty easy. Registries. And here we have an array. And if you remember, we have created Docker hosted repository with an HTTP connector. So the repository is available at IP address or host of Nexus, and this port, which is open for Docker repository specifically. So we are gonna add the IP address here and the port of the repository and not Nexus. We're gonna put them in quotes as well, like this. And this is Docker repository, which is insecure, so we have to register it explicitly. Let's save this file. And now we have to restart Docker so that this change can be applied. So we're gonna restart Docker using system control. systemctl, restart Docker, and Docker restarted. However, restarting Docker kills all the running containers, so Jenkins container won't be running anymore. You see there are no running containers. Docker ps -a gives us the stopped containers as well, so we can start it again. So let's start our Jenkins container. And while Jenkins is restarting, we need to do one more thing, which is reconfigure the permission to the docker.socket file. The file that is in var run docker. Let's do long output. This is what we configured before to add read and write permission to everyone who is not the owner and who is not in the group. And now that configuration got reset because we restarted Docker. So we need to change that again. However, if you remember, we did that actually inside the container. So let's do it again. Let's enter the container as root. I forgot the bash here. And change or add read-write permission to that file again. And read-write permission will be for each party. So this is for the owner, for the group, for the rest. Execute. And now we can check it again. And there we go. This should be the same actually on the host itself. Here you see the permission. So now we have reconfigured Docker to allow accessing Nexus, explicitly allowing our Docker repository on Nexus as an insecure registry. We have restarted Docker, re-added permission to the socket file, and now we can go back and configure our Jenkins job. So let's go back to Jenkins and reconfigure our build to push to our Docker repository on Nexus instead of Docker Hub. The first thing we need to do in Jenkins now is create credentials for Nexus because we don't have one yet. So I'm going to go into Manage Jenkins, Credentials. We have 2 credentials right now, GitLab and Docker Hub. And let's create another one for Nexus Docker repository. Nexus Docker repo. And now in our Java Maven build, instead of Docker Hub credentials, I'm gonna choose the Nexus Docker repository credentials. And here we need some changes. First of all, we said that we need to tag every image that we're pushing to the repository with the repository name, so the Docker client knows where to push that image, right? And this was the repository name of Docker Hub, which no longer applies now. I'm going to remove that, and we're going to use repository name of Nexus repository, which is the IP address and port of the repository. I believe this URL should work too. However, let's actually stick with the repository host that we have been using. So this is Nexus repository URL. This format, however, will not work, so we have to add the name here. We can actually call it Java Maven app, and let's have this as a tag. So this whole thing will actually be the name of the image. This will be the tag, and this will be the repository name of the image. And for the Docker login, as I mentioned, if you're not using Docker Hub, which is the default repository registry for Docker client, you have to specify the repository host. And in this case, we're not using Docker Hub, we're using Nexus. So right here at the end, I have to specify repository host. And obviously the password and username will be substituted from the correct credential for Nexus. And finally, in Docker push command, we need to update the image name. This is the image that we're building. So this is actually the name of that image, the full name. And then we're taking that image name and pushing to the repository that we just logged into. So I'm going to save this configuration and let's build it. And the build was successful. Let's see the console output. So image was built here. Docker login succeeded, and Docker push the image name. So we can go to Nexus, browse Docker hosted, and here is our image, Java Maven app. This is this part right here. So this was actually generated as this top level folder, Java Maven app, and inside we have tags, and this is the tag. And in the Jenkins container, if I do Docker images, I have a bunch of images already built, and this is our Java Maven app. So repository, this is the repository part, and this is the tag. And this builds the complete image name. So with this, we have successfully built and pushed a Docker image to our Nexus Docker repository. Of course, if our Nexus is secured and we have HTTPS here, we don't need to do the insecure configuration and Docker restart, etc. It will be easier, but we had to do it for this specific use case.